Ever wondered why your BMW's power seems to taper off when you're pushing the upper limits of the rev range? Or whether a modern 4-cylinder BMW engine could genuinely hit 500 crank horsepower without any other modifications? This turbo that I'm holding might just be the key to those mysteries. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're delving into the fascinating world of turbocharging with a particular focus on this powerhouse turbo that could redefine what we expect from a BMW B48 engine. We're going to unpack the complexities of turbocharger sizing, understand the role of back pressure in the turbine housing, and finally unravel the secret behind BMW's TwinPower turbo, aka twin scroll turbocharger. And we'll also touch on why high-end performance vehicles like the Nissan GTR prefer ceramic ball bearings. This journey promises to be an enlightening deep dive into turbocharging, so let's dive right in. So if you guys are new to my channel, that turbo is going on this G20 B48. The stock turbo is in great condition still. It's only got 40,000 miles on it, but we're doing it for the sake of upgrading. Okay, so to demonstrate the points in today's video, we're going to be using this complete N20 engine. This is the wastegate door. Right here you have the turbine housing and you have the turbine wheel, which is driven by exhaust gases. I just placed an 1.25 inch socket in there and it's almost a perfect fit, so we can use this for demonstration purposes. Now with the new turbo that I'm installing, that's more like the size. You can see that's about the difference in terms of turbine wheel size. Now these are kind of shaped like a funnel. Let's assume you had to fill up a bucket with oil and you had to grab these and they're the exact shape of a funnel. Which one would you grab to fill it up faster? You'd probably be going for this one because more volume can go through it without it being a bottleneck. Now conversely, imagine I said there's a whole bunch of sand on the floor and it's your job to clean it up. There's no battery in this. You can choose this, which is the nozzle of an air blower, or you could choose this tube from a turkey baster. Which would you choose if all you could do is use your lung? You'd be going for this because you know that you could create a whole bunch of speed and air velocity, and it'll be a lot more efficient to try to clean the floor of dust with your lungs with this. Because even if you can get your mouth around here, could you fill this whole area with enough volume of air to create enough pressure to make it worth it? No, your lungs are not big enough. So what does that mean? That means that you'd have to create pressure in this by trying to fill this cavity up as fast as possible, and it's not going to work out. But if you didn't have the velocity, instead you had the flow, you had the volume created by this huge fan here, it would make sense to use this. So with this high-powered battery and a lot of volume, you get a lot of work done. But you know, if I were to put my mouth on this and do the same thing, I can move the paper just as well, but I couldn't move it as aggressively. Now imagine the pistons and the bores of the block in this 4-cylinder engine have the capacity of human lungs. You would try to opt for something more like this versus this because you can't move as much air. So that's what dictates it being about this size versus being this size. Now when you look at this turbo and you see the size of this, it's kind of like the air blower. Sure, you can actually get a lot of work done with this, but are you going to be able to overcome this area and be able to create enough flow to make that spin and get the velocity you need? This is more like a B48 turbo or a 6-cylinder turbo in terms of how big that fan is and how much lung capacity of the engine would be required to be able to turn that. So that'll be the first lesson to consider. What would you rather have? Something that will do more work with less lung capacity and react faster? Or would you rather have something that could eventually flow harder? So if you're not familiar with how a turbocharger works, it's kind of like an exponential effect. As you can get this thing spinning and get a certain amount of volume out of here, that's naturally going to cause there to be air pulled in from here. So it's kind of like you get a snowball effect. You know, it's kind of obvious to most of you guys, I'm sure, but you need the snowball effect to eventually overcome the fact that there's only so much air that could leave here. So how do you get more air to leave here? Bring in more air from here. How do you have that happen? You roll down a hill, you get a snowball effect till eventually, yeah, it may take longer to spool up, but you will eventually get enough air to come in here to create as much work as you want to dictate via this wastegate door. So it is possible to use a small turbo and try to overwork it and get to a goal. But there was something very special about this N20 motor when BMW introduced it. They were trying to wow the doubters with regards to replacing an inline 6-cylinder with a 4-cylinder. They wanted to pull out all the stops and make sure this thing could spool and make torque in a way that people are not used to even on a really big 3-liter straight 6. They weren't playing any games. This thing isn't just about, is it reasonable, can it spool at 3,500 RPM? You guys wouldn't like these cars and the way the torque comes on if that was the case. Sure, you could eventually make your car go fast, but if you want it to be a big displacement replacement, you're going to need torque under 1500 RPM, and this thing does that all day long. So if there's literally only one takeaway from this video, it would be the fact that this is your gatekeeper. No pun intended because of the wastegate here, But this is going to dictate how much power you can make before you're going to just be creating hot air. Because if this is too small, if you're pulling in enough air and you're trying to exhaust it out the turbine wheel, eventually you'll get to the point where it's backing up and it can't exit fast enough because this hole is just too small. There's not enough volume that can pass through here before you're going to start having it go the other way, and that's going to make this thing get extra hot because that hot exhaust gas is going to get bound up and built up inside here, which is going to cause you to make inefficient power. Now there's something to be said with regards to the inlet side or the compressor side and the size of this wheel along with the size of the compressor housing and how much air it could stuff in here before it makes it too hot and less dense. Therefore, even though you're making PSI, you're making pressure, you're not necessarily introducing useful air because it's going to be hot and not very dense. Because not all turbos are created equally. Now, just because you can create the pressure doesn't mean you have the volume. You don't have the CFM to match that, so it's not the same thing as having a bigger turbo making a certain amount of pressure. This just can make that pressure pounds per square inch, but there's not going to be as much CFM or work or volume coming out of it because of the restriction of the size of the hole. So now we've covered the fact that this is a 6-cylinder replacement engine, and they made this turbo try to feel like it was a kind of like a 3.5 liter 6 in terms of how the torque comes on. You're going to have to choose between having the velocity and having the flow at low RPMs and giving up on having the flow at high RPMs. So that would be the #1 complaint of an engine like this, or even the twin turbos on an N54. It's going to be the fact that there's a bias toward choosing low-end torque versus high-end horsepower. Now I've labeled these. Imagine this is after cylinders 1, 3, 4, and 2 have fired. Imagine this at the end of one cycle. So this fired and eventually the pulses made it down here. This fired and eventually the pulses made it here. And then this fired and made it here. This fired and it's right at the beginning of this exiting. Now this is a cutaway of a BMW turbocharger. If you take a look here, you'll see that on the exhaust side of the turbo, the turbine side, there's 2 different size bumps right here, and these are called volutes. This is where the twin scroll happens. So you have one scroll that's more direct and it hits the turbine wheel straight on with more volume, so it's larger. So this would be responsible for keeping things spun up when you're at higher RPMs. And then you have one on an angle that is going to approach the blades with higher velocity and at a more extreme angle to be able to spool at low RPMs. So this is kind of like 2 turbos in one. On the exhaust side, the actual turbine wheel is designed so that as exhaust is trying to leave, it can't just go straight out. It has to make a turn on the way and it has to hit this angle right here. So as it's hitting the angle, it will spin this wheel. So now if you have something that is not trying to hit it straight, but trying to hit it like right at this angle, it's really going to aggressively get this thing rolling, get the ball rolling, so to speak. When they made this exhaust manifold for the N20 and the N55, they kind of went to town in terms of the quality of this and the way it mounts and just the technology. I think they found ways to bring the cost down considerably, and I'll show you the difference. But really, this is all encapsulated inside this heat shield to keep the heat in here, to keep the velocities high and keep the efficiency high. So now that makes it hard to demonstrate what's really going on. The only way we could demonstrate is to cut this off and show you the individual pipes and all that, but we can easily do it on the new turbo. Now what's very obvious is you can still see the 2 scrolls here. The one that's going to be high volume, high RPM, straight on. The one at an angle, low RPM, high velocity, low volume. This is one scroll, this is the other. You can see that clearly. And with regards to the B48 turbo, you can see it clearly as well. The install kits are very simple now because it just wedges in at the bottom. It's a cast manifold and you have studs at the top. You can use less hardware to mount it. So this is a cast manifold now, but it's very obvious to trace what's going on. As you can notice, first thing you're going to see is it's not equal length, nor was the N20. But you can see cylinder 1, cylinder 4, cylinder 2, cylinder 3. So it's not like they went out of their way to make sure this was very bulky and equal length, because they didn't need to. They could just play around with the design of the exhaust turbine side to make it work. Now when cylinder 1 fires, it's got to travel a little bit further. Cylinder 4 has really got to travel to eventually hit the high volume scroll. If you had 2 scrolls to drive and you needed one to get spun up faster, you might as well use the shortest distance to get it driven. So if you trace this and this, they're very short, so you might as well have that drive the high velocity angled scroll because it's got to travel less distance to get the ball rolling. Now you can see cylinder 2 being lit up by my light. Here's the wastegate arm. If I were to stick my light through here, the upper one, light is shooting out right here, cylinder 2. And if I were to stick my light through cylinder 3 and then open the door, you'll still see some light coming in through this top half. If I were to stick the light through here, you can barely make out some light coming in through the bottom half. Much more obvious on cylinder 1. So how does this door move back and forth to vary the boost? It does electronically on modern BMWs. This is an N20 wastegate. It changes the door here. If these were flipped 180 degrees, then you could be shutting off one side completely before the other side. So they couldn't have had that. They have to equally be affected by the angle of this. So as this closes, it's gonna create a 45-degree cutoff. So it's gonna partially close both the scrolls. So just by design, the cylinders that are responsible for spooling the turbo are shorter and in closer proximity to the turbine housing. Therefore, they drive this. And then the further away cylinders that are gonna eventually overcome the distance with high RPMs drive this. But they still both contribute. They all contribute equally. So now if you're to design an exhaust manifold for your turbo, you'd want to have a tubular one that would individually go to a central collector that is low restriction. But you'll still be faced with one problem. No matter how hard you try, you got 4 cylinders in a row. As one fires, the one next to it may be trying to fire in a similar amount of time. Because this has to travel a further distance, you know, one's gonna win. The one closest is gonna have an edge. And if you try to fire this one, it's not gonna be able to do the work of contributing to spinning the turbine wheel, because it's probably gonna be pushing some gas back into one of the other cylinders, because they're creating pressure waves and you want to time them so they don't have to overlap. So how could you do that? You know, you could just do a good design on your manifold so that you can fire the cylinders at the right time, so that maybe you can avoid overlap anyway and then hope they merge here. But then you're still dealing with non-equal length. Therefore, you're better off separating them into 2 scrolls, one for the longer distance, one for the shorter distance. But you still want to be very conscious of the fact that no overlap should ever happen. So I'm repeating myself, but hopefully it's clear that as one cylinder is trying to expel gas, if they're both coming in at similar times, it'll push the gas back into the cylinder and even cause detonation. So here's the exhaust stroke. The valve is going to be opening up as the piston's coming up to allow for exhaust gases to be expelled out of the ports. It's going to use the work of the piston coming up and getting rid of the volume in there to expel gases. So now we're on the other side of the block. This is the intake side. As this is coming up, it's pushing air out the exhaust. Intake valves are closed. But what happens when you get close to the end of the travel of this, they need to open up so they can be ready to start drawing air in. And eventually the piston's going to go down, and then it's going to create a vacuum effect, and it's going to suck in air into the cylinder. But the effect of the exhaust being pushed out is causing vacuum to come into here, because you're creating velocity of air leaving the exhaust side and entering here. The work of the exhaust leaving is creating negative pressure inside the bore, which is causing air to want to rush in, and in a more even way. It's going to mix the air and fuel better than if you had just waited for all the exhaust gas to leave and then open the intake valves, because you're going to have abrupt vacuum that all of a sudden has to suck in whatever air is waiting behind the valve, versus having a little bit of overlap where it can bring in air from here due to the vacuum effect of the exhaust leaving the exhaust side, and not only just the effect of it sucking in the air as it's on its way down, because you have that momentum, you have that area where the piston hasn't even started to move down yet, where it's already drawn in air due to the exhaust valve being open and expelling air, creating negative pressure inside. So you want a bit of overlap. So it's all about trying to separate the 2 scrolls, and that's where the magic of this comes into play. When one fires, the next one to fire is 3. But if you know from what we've shown, they're not sharing the same tubes to lead to here. So the overlap or the loss of potential energy because the intake valves are open cannot interfere with this, because by the time this fires, this is fired. They're on separate scrolls, so therefore the fact that the intake valves are open on another cylinder will not cause it to lose the power of the exhaust pulse leaving, because it's isolated from the fact that the other intake valve is open. So you get the benefits of scavenging with the valve overlap of the intake valves, but you have these independent, so they're not going to see the negative pressure of the intake valve being open, because it's going to always be on opposing scrolls. 1 fires, 3 fires, so it doesn't matter that there's overlap, because this was not affected. They're on different tubes. So therefore you have as much dense energy as possible contributing to spooling the turbo and not losing any of that energy. And these are the waves, the pressure waves. If you were to have all this going into one collector, when one valve opens, everything's going great. You have a very aggressive pulse, and then one intake valve opens for overlap. It kind of wants to suck the exhaust back in this way, and then you got to wait for them to close for it to kind of get its bearings again. But when they're isolated on different scrolls, there's no way for the overlap to interfere with the work that the exhaust gases can do on the turbine wheel. So that's why they really boast TwinPower turbo. You have a big turbo and a small turbo sequentially driven, so to speak, being fired by 2 cylinders each. You could have put 2 monoscroll turbos here, one being really small, one being really big, but then you'll kind of choke things out. With the logic of the electronic wastegate and the fact that you can change the angle to kind of gear toward making them both do the same amount of work, you can overcome a lot. That's why when they went to electronic wastegates over pneumatic, it happened on the N20. The 2013 had a electronic, this is electronic, and then the 2012 had pneumatic. You can still vary the precision of the door via the pneumatic, but you get more benefits because you can play around with the logic of the twin scroll, in my opinion. All right, so let's talk about this turbo. It's going to be capable of allowing the engine to make 500 horsepower. Specs-wise, it's made by a company called In Pursuit of Speed Motorsport. They graciously provided a discount to feature it, and we're going to definitely show what it's capable of. On the compressor side, it is a 0.57 AR, so area over radius, aka just how much volume you're going to find inside this. So it's about 10% bigger than the factory turbo. Factory turbo is 0.52 on this side. And then naturally you'll have a different size compressor wheel and turbine wheel. This has a mod just to allow for more sound. These are called compressor holes, just for more drama really. Now on the exhaust side, turbine side is 0.61 versus 0.57, so close to 10% bigger. So overall you would say this thing's going to spool at least 10% slower, but you get the benefit of making more power. So what should happen is you shift your power band higher up, you're going to lose low end torque. Even if you have this twin scroll technology and you use the same logic, or even a tuner knows how to make this thing spool up, lean spool, etc., to be able to get it rolling faster, or anti-lag, all that kind of stuff, it doesn't change the fact that in day-to-day driving that partial throttle torque would hit 10% later because it's bigger. But then you'll be able to make a lot more power up high. That everybody knows that about aftermarket turbos. Now, this thing has a trick up its sleeve, and I'll give you a couple hints. First hint, I'm taking off the oil feed banjo bolt. Now, if you're to look at that, there's just a tiny pinhole to feed the oil feed line. And that would be very little flow, just enough to keep the bearings lubricated, but not pressurized. If you were to use this feed line to feed your stock turbo, it would probably last 100 miles. One more hint before I fully tell you. If you notice, there's zero play on this. It's completely stiff. So if that's so tight, where would the oil go to fill the void under pressure to allow for this not to make metal on metal contact? So that gets back to the title of this video. It's a turbo that BMW would have loved to have used if money were no object. It's a dual ceramic ball bearing turbo. A journal bearing turbo is fed by oil pressure, and the shaft floats on the oil, kind of like a crankshaft in a car. So it just fills the gap and then it rides on a layer of oil, versus a ball bearing. It's literally just like bearings in a skateboard. The oil just keeps them lubricated, and it's a much lower resistance, leading to faster spool, which naturally would spool about 10 to 15% faster than stock. But that only applies if you have a lower displacement engine. You can really reap the benefits of having less resistance on the oiling system for the impeller shaft. So if you had a big V8, you'll maybe notice a slight difference. You'll always notice partial throttle tip in, because that thing will just keep rolling and it won't slow down as much as you're already giving it halfway throttle. But if you're talking about being able to spool off idle from a stop, it should spool about as fast as the stock journal bearing turbo would have spooled, because it's around, let's just be realistic and say 7 or 8% better, and that's about the difference in the AR sizing. So with that turbo, you can have all the benefits of this twin scroll low end torque, yet all the lack of resistance on the turbine side to make 400 crank horsepower all day long. If they could charge an extra couple $1,000s to the MSRP, could they have offered a version of this engine with a dual ceramic ball bearing turbo to spool like stock but make 400 horsepower? Yes, they could have, but they don't do that. They'd rather give you a bigger turbo and then call it an E model, like a 330E, and have an electric motor that is driven at the back of the engine to fill the gap of where the turbo would have normally spooled and fill in that 10% difference. So they'll have a bigger turbo. You get the torque punch that you're used to, but it's supplemented via a hybrid system for better fuel economy anyway. So has there ever been a case where dual ceramic ball bearings are utilized from the factory to have better spooling? Yes, the Nissan GTR did it, but of course those MSRP over 100 grand. So that was a clip of my N54, and that features dual mono scroll turbos because you don't really need the benefits of twin scroll on such a small turbo. It's kind of like having the two scrolls anyway. Have I seen implementations of mono scroll turbos that are dual ceramic ball bearing? Yes, but they're not really designed for the high velocities, and you could maybe experience premature life expectancy. If you're going to rev really high, maybe you don't want dual ceramic ball bearings. But for this application, it's perfect. For instance, the S58 and the G80 has mono scroll journal bearing turbos anyway. So if you have a B48 and you want to make realistically 360 wheel on 91 octane, or maybe 380 wheel on 93 octane, 400 to 420 wheel on E50, which you can do with factory fuel pumps, or 450 wheel with port injection, aka 500 crank horsepower, this is the ticket. This is going to give you stock-like spooling with no downsides, and I plan to report back on how this all works out. Another thing to mention is if you ever see people talking about stock-like spool on a journal bearing turbo, it's likely because they feature a lighter weight billet wheel, which is naturally going to have less inertia. I'm going to put a link in the description if you guys are interested in this. It will be an affiliate link, which would help the channel. There's about a 2 to 5 week wait for one of these if you guys want to follow along. I imagine once people see what this thing's really capable of, and when I report back on how the car feels and how I've transformed it, yet not really lost the daily drivability, maybe that lead time will increase. So if you want one of them, you can be an early adopter and follow along with me. They offer the option of getting an install kit from them. That turbo is called the IM450. You'll get your feed lines, you'll get a new downpipe gasket, wastegate, controller, copper nuts for the turbo studs, a new downpipe clamp, and then you have a new exhaust manifold gasket, and then of course you're going to have a downpipe. It's going to be a must to go with a downpipe to be able to achieve the power levels that I was looking to achieve. There's the name of the company. As you can see, this was graciously provided by them. Without saying a whole lot, that's what it looks like on the inside. So I'll include a link for the downpipe as well as a turbo. So this is the IM450. And then you have the option of a T51R mod or a compressor hole mod just for more noise. I like the idea of having a factory-like inlet. That hasn't arrived yet. I'm going to have that soon. But once you pop the hood, you wouldn't know the car isn't completely stock, but you still get some noise when you're on it. But that's a mod you can do. This is the IM450. You can get the IM500 if you want to go hardcore and go for more power, but then you're going to lose out on some of that spoolability. And I really wanted to drive like a stock car, yet run low 12s, and this is going to be the ticket. So hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how TwinPower turbo technology works, and if money was no object, could you have all the benefits of kind of like a hybrid model in terms of torque fill with an electric motor via the ceramic ball bearings, and beat out the newer M-Lite 6-cylinders in terms of their power, yet have amazing fuel economy. I think that's the future of the internal combustion engine as we get into the late 2020s and early 2030s, as well as the hybridization. If you've seen the C63, it features a 2-liter 4-cylinder. It's just costly to run dual ceramic ball bearings, but if you want to do it on the aftermarket end after you own the car, you can have a little monster for cheap. So that's an introduction to this turbo. If you guys have a B48, it's called the B46D in the G20, but it goes by B48 or B46. You know, I've already covered in a previous video, I'll link to it below, where you don't have the limitation of this N20 motor in terms of the internals and being able to make that type of power. In the next video, we're going to be installing that turbo and getting ready to start tuning and seeing what it's capable of. So if you're new to my channel, definitely subscribe to see how this all plays out. In the next video, we're going to be installing it. If this is the first video you're catching on mine, please consider subscribing. If you liked it, please give it a like so I rank higher. Thanks for watching.